What if the greatest victory in modern history was actually the most expensive loss a nation ever suffered? Britain didn't just win the Second World War, it paid for it with its future. And almost no one was told the price up front. The bombs stopped falling, the sirens went silent, the flags went up, and the crowds filled the streets believing they were watching the return of a victorious empire. But beneath the celebrations, beneath the speeches and parades, something far darker was already unfolding. Something that would hollow out British power more effectively than any German bomber ever could. When the smoke finally cleared, Britain did not emerge as the master of the post-war world. It emerged as a bankrupt debtor nation, rationing bread in peacetime, begging its closest ally for emergency loans, and quietly dismantling an empire that had ruled nearly a quarter of humanity. The country that had once been the banker of the world could no longer pay its own bills. The empire that had shaped global trade for centuries was suddenly selling assets just to stay alive. This is not a story about tanks, generals, or battlefield defeat. Britain did not lose the war with bullets or bombs. It lost it with contracts, balance sheets, and signatures written under extreme pressure. The British Empire did not collapse in flames on the battlefield. It was liquidated in conference rooms, audited by foreign officials, and dismantled deal by deal, quietly, legally, and with terrifying efficiency. We're taught a version of this story that feels comforting, almost cinematic in its simplicity. Britain stood alone against the darkness. America eventually came to help, democracy survived, and together the free world won. Roll credits. But that version cuts away right before the bill hits the table. It skips the part where survival had a price tag, and where that price was calculated not in blood, but in gold, assets, and long-term power, under the speeches and radio addresses. Another war was unfolding, a quieter one, fought with ledgers instead of rifles. From the very start, the Second World War wasn't just rearranging borders on maps, it was rearranging balance sheets. Every bomb dropped, every convoy sunk, every factory converted to war production pushed Britain deeper into financial dependence. Britain could fight, but it could no longer pay. By late 1940, after draining its gold reserves and shipping what remained across the Atlantic in Operation Fish, the country that had once financed the world was out of cash. Not eventually, not hypothetically, completely. What followed was not charity. It was a transaction. The public story spoke of friendship and shared values, but the machinery underneath operated like a bank dealing with a desperate borrower. Aid did not flow until Britain proved it had nothing left to sell. Gold first, then investments, then income-generating companies. The mechanism was simple and brutal: no dollars unless assets were liquidated. No survival without surrendering future leverage. Each step made the next unavoidable, tightening like a ratchet, and the consequences compounded. As Britain sold assets to survive the present, it weakened its position in the future. As it accepted help, it accepted conditions. By the time the war ended, the accounting was already done. One nation emerged holding most of the world's gold, controlling strategic military bases across the Atlantic, dominating global markets, and writing the rules of post-war trade. The other emerged with victory parades, war memories, and an empire that could no longer sustain itself. That is the reversal history rarely lingers on. One side inherited the future, the other inherited the memory of greatness. By September 1939, Britain walked into the war still wearing the costume of a superpower. On paper, it looked unbreakable. Vast gold reserves sat behind the pound. Overseas investments stretched across the Americas. British citizens owned railways in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, and profitable factories inside the United States itself. London remained the nerve center of global insurance and shipping, the place where the world's trade was priced, insured, and trusted. If you froze the moment on a map, Britain still looked like the banker of the world. But Hitler's war was not a war of flags and borders. It was a war of machines, and machines do not run on prestige. They run on steel, oil, rubber, and aluminum, commodities Britain did not have in sufficient supply. Almost everything that kept its army, navy, and air force alive had to be imported. When Germany sealed off Europe and the U-boats began strangling Atlantic shipping lanes, Britain's economic reality snapped into focus. The empire could fight, but it could not feed or fuel itself alone. Survival narrowed to a single lifeline stretching west across the ocean. The problem was that the United States was still neutral. Congress had locked the door with the Neutrality Acts. No loans, no credit, only cash and carry. If Britain wanted planes, tanks, ammunition, or fuel, it had to pay immediately, in US dollars, and haul everything home on its own ships. This wasn't hostility, it was policy. And policy doesn't bend for desperation, so Britain paid month after month. It drained gold reserves to meet American invoices. Cash disappeared. Assets were quietly liquidated to keep contracts alive. Each payment bought time, but each one also shrank the margin for survival. This was the hidden mechanism beginning to turn every weapon purchased today, reduce Britain's ability to pay tomorrow. The war effort consumed not just resources, but the future income that would have replaced them. Then came the moment that revealed how close to the edge Britain truly was. In a secret operation later known as Operation Fish, the British government made a decision no empire had ever made before. It loaded the nation's remaining gold reserves and negotiable securities onto ships and sent them across the Atlantic to Canada for safekeeping and for payment. Billions of dollars in physical wealth were packed into crates and sailed through submarine-infested waters, not to conquer territory, but to settle accounts. By late 1940, the operation was complete. The gold was gone, the liquid cash was gone, the vaults were empty. Britain was still standing, still fighting, still defiant, but now it was fighting on borrowed time, with no financial cushion left. From that moment on, the war could no longer be won with money Britain already had. It could only be won with money it did not control. By December 1940, Winston Churchill understood that Britain's fate no longer rested only on bombers and battleships. It rested on a letter. Sitting in the underground cabinet war rooms, with London burning above him, he wrote to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The tone was respectful, strategic, almost calm, but beneath the careful phrasing was a confession no British Prime Minister had ever made before. Britain was broke. The Treasury was approaching the point where it could no longer pay cash for weapons. Contracts were stalling. Orders for planes and tanks sat unsigned, not because factories couldn't produce them, but because Britain no longer had the dollars to pay for them. Roosevelt read the letter and immediately grasped the danger. If Britain collapsed, the Atlantic would no longer be a moat. It would be a highway. But Roosevelt was trapped by his own system. American law forbade direct financial aid. The public was deeply isolationist. Congress was hostile to anything that smelled like another European war. He couldn't hand Britain money, even if he wanted to. So instead of changing the law outright, he changed the story. He reframed rescue as practicality. He called it Lend-Lease. To the public, it sounded humane and neighborly, like lending a garden hose to put out a fire next door. But behind closed doors, the tone was very different. Once the spotlight moved away from speeches and press conferences, the operation shifted from diplomacy to accounting. The man holding the pen was Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. Morgenthau believed in defeating fascism, but he believed just as strongly in protecting the American taxpayer. And in his eyes, Britain was no longer an ally in need, it was a bankrupt entity seeking credit, before a single dollar of aid could flow. Morgenthau demanded proof, not promises. Proof. Britain had to demonstrate that it had exhausted every asset it possessed. And this didn't stop at government holdings. Private British wealth was dragged into the light. Factories owned by British companies abroad, shares held by British citizens, profitable companies operating inside the United States, income streams that had quietly supported Britain's balance of payments for decades. Morgenthau wanted a full inventory, a complete financial X-ray of the British Empire. The mechanism was cold but simple. If Britain still had assets, those assets should be sold first. Why? Morgenthau asked. Should an American farmer in Iowa pay for a British tank if a British investor still owned a profitable factory in New Jersey? From Washington's perspective, aid was not charity, it was conditional survival. Every dollar of assistance would be matched by a dollar of British sacrifice. At that moment, the relationship fundamentally changed. Britain was no longer pleading as a sovereign equal, it was submitting paperwork. Negotiations began to resemble receivership meetings. Balance sheets replaced battle plans. The language of alliance quietly gave way to the language of audits. Britain was still fighting for its life, but now it was doing so under examination, with a foreign power deciding what it could keep, what it had to sell, and how much of its future it would have to surrender just to stay alive. By early 1941, the audit turned into a demand. Washington wasn't just asking Britain to prove it was broken, it wanted a visible sacrifice. Something concrete it could point to as evidence that Britain was truly bleeding. That sacrifice took the shape of one company, and it wasn't chosen at random. American Viscose Corporation was the crown jewel of British overseas investment in the United States. It was the largest rayon manufacturer in the country, massively profitable, and quietly sending millions of dollars back across the Atlantic every year. In a war where dollars meant survival, it was one of the last reliable income streams Britain still controlled. Henry Morgenthau locked onto it immediately. From his perspective, the logic was ruthless but clean. If Britain still owned a cash-generating industrial giant on American soil, then Britain was not yet entitled to American aid. He demanded the company be sold, and not at some convenient future date. Now. The British negotiators recoiled. They explained what any investor would know instinctively: selling a major industrial asset in the middle of a war, under visible duress, would be a financial disaster. American Viscose was worth over $100 million. Forced onto the market, it would fetch far less. It was a fire sale, and everyone would know it. Morgenthau didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He simply raised the stakes. The Lend-Lease bill was still moving through Congress, under attack from isolationists who claimed Britain was secretly rich and trying to offload its war costs onto American taxpayers. Morgenthau made the sale of American Viscose the proof they needed. Sell the company, or Lend-Lease would die in committee. That was the ultimatum. On March 15, 1941, under emergency wartime powers, the British government acted. American Viscose was seized from its British owners without consent and rushed onto the market. There was no mystery about the outcome. Everyone knew Britain had no choice. The buyers knew it. The bankers knew it. The leverage was gone before negotiations even began. The price collapsed under the weight of desperation. The company was sold for roughly $54 million, barely half its real value. The dollars from the sale never even passed through British hands. They went straight into the US Treasury to pay for weapons already ordered. Back in London, the British government compensated the original owners in pounds. Adding to its own internal debt, Britain lost a major income-producing asset, absorbed the financial damage, and gained nothing lasting in return except the right to keep fighting. This was the moment the illusion shattered. The British negotiators finally understood the mechanism they were trapped inside. This wasn't a partnership. It wasn't solidarity. It was collateralization. Britain wasn't being helped as an equal ally. It was being stripped, asset by asset, to secure its own survival. From that point on, every negotiation carried the same silent message. You are not standing beside us. You are standing on the auction block. As the financial vice tightened, the war at sea began to turn lethal. German U-boats were tearing through the Atlantic faster than Britain could replace the ships they were sinking. Merchant convoys vanished into the cold water. Food, fuel, and raw materials never reached port. The ocean that once protected the island was becoming a killing field. Britain didn't just need money anymore. It needed ships immediately, or the entire war effort would choke to death offshore. Winston Churchill went back to Franklin Roosevelt with a specific request: 50 American destroyers. These weren't cutting-edge warships. They were old, World War I era vessels, sitting idle in American naval yards, obsolete by modern standards and of limited value to the Navy, to Britain, though they represented survival floating barriers against the submarines closing in on its lifeline. Roosevelt agreed to the deal. But once again, agreement did not mean generosity. It meant exchange. The destroyers would not be given. They would be traded, and the price was not money, it was territory. In return for 50 aging ships, the United States demanded 99-year leases on a chain of British naval and air bases stretching across the Atlantic world. Newfoundland, the Caribbean, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad, British Guyana. One by one, the dots connected into a map of strategic dominance. This was not a temporary arrangement. These were not short-term staging grounds. A 99-year lease might as well have been permanent in geopolitical terms. Britain was handing over control of key choke points, ports, and airfields that guarded the Western Hemisphere. Bases that had once secured imperial trade routes were now being repurposed to project American power outward. Decade after decade, the mechanism was the same one already at work, just operating at a higher level. When Britain lacked ships, it paid with assets. When it lacked cash, it paid with companies. When it lacked naval protection, it paid with geography. Each concession solved an immediate crisis while quietly transferring long-term advantage elsewhere. The emergency never ended, it only escalated, and each solution required something more permanent than the last. From the outside, It could be framed as cooperation between allies. But strip away the language, and the structure was unmistakable. Britain was trading tomorrow for today. Long-term strategic control was being exchanged for short-term tactical relief. This wasn't alliance building, it was the systematic transfer of power. One lease, one base, one desperate deal at a time. By March 1941, Lend-Lease finally passed, and on the surface, it looked like salvation. Britain could breathe again. Weapons would flow, food would arrive, the island would not starve into surrender. But survival came wrapped in paperwork, and buried inside that paperwork was a clause so quietly written that few outside the negotiating rooms noticed it at the time. Article 7 was only a paragraph long, no dramatic language, no obvious threat, just diplomatic phrasing that looked harmless if you didn't understand what it touched. What it touched was the economic spine of the British Empire. Under Article 7, Britain agreed that once the war was over, it would dismantle its imperial preference system. That system was not a footnote. It was the mechanism that held the empire together. Imperial preference meant that Britain and its colonies traded with each other on favorable terms. British goods entered colonial markets cheaply. Colonial raw materials flowed back to Britain reliably. It was a closed loop that protected British industry from more efficient foreign competitors, especially American manufacturers. Without imperial preference, the empire stopped functioning as an economic unit. British factories would have to compete head-to-head with American industry inside markets they had once dominated by design. And American industry, untouched by bombing and scaled up by wartime production, was already faster, cheaper, and more productive. Article 7 didn't just promise free trade after the war. It guaranteed that British protection would be stripped away at the exact moment Britain was weakest. The British negotiators knew this. They argued. They warned that dismantling imperial preference would leave Britain exposed, unable to rebuild its economy or sustain its global position. They understood that this clause didn't just shape the post-war economy, it determined who would own it. But leverage decides outcomes, not arguments. And Britain had none left. The bombs were still falling over British cities. German submarines were still hunting in the Atlantic. The treasury was empty, the gold was gone. Every day without American supplies brought the risk of collapse closer. Article 7 became the price of continued survival, a future concession signed under present terror. So Britain agreed, quietly, reluctantly, desperately. In that moment, the empire didn't fall, it committed itself to falling later. The war would be won first. The consequences would come after. Article 7 ensured that when peace arrived, Britain would not return to the world it had left behind. It would return to a market it could no longer control, governed by rules written by someone else, enforced by power that had already shifted across the Atlantic. By August 1945, the war finally ended, and Britain exhaled. Bonfires burned in the streets, crowds packed public squares, strangers embraced under a sky no longer filled with bombers. After 6 years of total war, the country believed the worst was over. Victory had arrived. And with it came the quiet assumption that survival would now turn into recovery. That assumption lasted exactly 7 days. 1 week after Japan surrendered, President Harry Truman signed the order that shut off Lend-Lease. The cutoff was immediate and absolute. There was no transition period, no warning, no easing back into peace. Aid did not slow down, it stopped. Out in the Atlantic, American ships already loaded with food, tools, and supplies bound for British ports were ordered to turn around and sail home. Cargo that Britain was counting on simply vanished over the horizon. The effect was instant. Britain's entire wartime economy had been built around American aid. Factories had been converted exclusively to war production. Exports had been abandoned. Markets overseas had been left unattended. The country was no longer structured to function without dollar support. When the tap was shut off, the system seized up almost overnight. John Maynard Keynes looked at the numbers and saw catastrophe. Britain was importing half of its food and almost all of its raw materials. Those imports had been paid for with Lend-Lease dollars. Without them, Britain wasn't drifting toward bankruptcy, it was already there, instantly insolvent. Keynes described the situation as a financial Dunkirk, a moment where retreat was not a strategy but a necessity to avoid collapse. The consequences weren't abstract. Without imports, factories would stall. Without food shipments, rationing would tighten past wartime levels. Without raw materials, unemployment would surge. Social stability itself came into question. The country that had just helped defeat Nazi Germany now faced the possibility of starvation and economic breakdown in peacetime. The hidden mechanism revealed itself in full. Aid had never been a gift, it was a switch. And the moment the strategic need disappeared, the switch flipped. Victory did not bring relief. It triggered the reckoning. Britain had survived the war, but it had done so by building an economy dependent on an external lifeline. When that lifeline was cut, there was only one option left. Britain had to beg. By the time 1946 arrived, Britain's options had narrowed to a single, brutal path. John Maynard Keynes crossed the Atlantic, carrying not spreadsheets, but a plea. He went to Washington, believing there was still a moral argument to be made that Britain had stood alone in the early years, had burned through its wealth to hold the line, had sacrificed its economic future to save Western civilization. What he asked for was not charity, but recognition. A grant, a settlement, a closing of the books on a war Britain had helped win at unbearable cost. The answer was flat, immediate, and final. There would be no grant, no gift, no moral accounting. There would only be a loan. The United States offered $3.75 billion, and it would come with interest and conditions. Britain could take it or face collapse. Keynes understood the humiliation instantly. This wasn't assistance between equals. It was survival financing dictated by the only power with cash left. The most dangerous condition was buried in the term sterling convertibility. Within 1 year, Britain would be required to make the pound fully convertible into US dollars. On paper, it sounded like free trade and financial normalcy. In reality, it was a trap. Keynes saw it immediately. Anyone holding pounds governments, colonies. Trading partners would rush to exchange them for dollars. Everyone wanted American goods. American factories were stronger, newer, untouched by bombing. Dollars meant access to the future. Pounds did not. Convertibility began on July 15, 1947. The reaction was instant and violent. Sterling poured out of Britain as countries cashed in their balances. Reserves evaporated at terrifying speed. Within weeks, hundreds of millions of dollars were gone. The loan that was supposed to stabilize Britain for years was bleeding out in real time. The mechanism Keynes had warned about unfolded exactly as predicted. On August 20th, 1947, Britain was forced to suspend convertibility. The window slammed shut. The experiment was over. The damage was irreversible. Britain had exposed its weakness to the world, and the world had responded without mercy. Confidence in the pound was shattered. 2 years later, in 1949, the final acknowledgement arrived. Britain devalued the pound from $4.86 to $2.80. Overnight, the nation lost roughly 30% of its global purchasing power. Imports became more expensive. Living standards fell. The economic foundations of empire crumbled. This was the last stage of the process. Not collapse, but stripping. Not defeat, but exhaustion. By the end of the 1940s, Britain still had a flag, a parliament, and a victory narrative, but the empire as a functioning economic system was finished. The war had been won. The future had been forfeited. Britain did defeat Nazi Germany. That part is true. But it did so by spending something it could never replace. It spent its inheritance. Gold moved west. Strategic bases changed hands. Protected markets were opened. And without a single invading army, global power quietly shifted across the Atlantic. The war ended in 1945, but the bill did not. The final payment on the 1946 loan wasn't made until December 29, 2006, more than 60 years after victory celebrations filled the streets. An entire lifetime later, the cost was still being settled. That's the part modern history rarely sits with. In total war, there are no clean winners. There are only survivors and the ones who finance survival. Germany lost and was physically destroyed. Britain won and was financially liquidated. And the United States, untouched at home, financed the war, absorbed the assets, rewrote the rules, and bought the future. Not with conquest, but with contracts. Empires don't always collapse in fire and rubble. Sometimes they dissolve through paperwork. Sometimes they're sold off piece by piece, under pressure, to pay for doing what felt morally unavoidable at the time. Britain didn't fall, it was settled, balanced, closed out, and this isn't ancient history, it's a pattern. When survival is financed, the bill never disappears, it only waits. If you want to understand the present, don't just listen to speeches or study flags, read the contracts. Because real power doesn't announce itself with parades or promises. It sends an invoice.